Good evening. I'm Joe O'Connor with EBS Newspaper, and this is the Big Sky Virtual Town Hall. I'd like to thank our sponsors first, Lone Mountain Land Company, and our publisher, Outlaw Partners. We have a special treat for you tonight. Brian Schweitzer lives his life in chapters. He was born in Havre, Montana, one of 6 kids. He earned a master's in soil science from Montana State University. He was an irrigation developer in Libya and worked to start the world's largest dairy farm. And he speaks Arabic. And he's anything but shy. He served as Montana's 23rd governor for 2 terms from 2005 to 2013. During his tenure in the governor's office, Schweitzer vetoed more than 130 bills, and he did it in his own way with, what else? A branding iron. Brian Schweitzer, welcome to the show.
Well, great to be with you.
We first met after I moved to Montana from Boston in 2012. I'd been here about 2 weeks as a reporter, and then learned I was interviewing you, which had me a little terrified. I showed up in a sports coat, and you told me I was better dressed than you were.
Well, you were, and most of the people that came to the governor's office were better dressed than me, but I was more comfortable than they were.
That's true. Well, I knew it would be a fun interview, and it was. Governor Schweitzer, you were a Democrat, and you had a Republican lieutenant governor, John Bollinger. Tell me about that decision, how that came about. You know, what are your thoughts on a split ticket candidate now?
Well, listen, I hadn't been in politics. I hadn't been elected to anything when I ran for governor. And people said, well, now how can you be governor? You haven't even served in the legislature. You haven't been a county commissioner or even sit on a city council of some kind. And I knew that I was going to have to surround myself with good people. I was pretty comfortable that I could figure it out. I've started businesses on 3 continents. I've learned to speak enough Arabic to do business in both Saudi Arabia and Libya. I ran ranches in Montana. I exported frozen embryos, cattle, and seed all over the world. I knew that I could figure this thing out. And I also knew that I had to surround myself with good people. And I met John Bollinger. I had some friends who said, you know, you're just going to have to meet this guy. He is an extraordinary individual. He is a Republican, but I think you two would work well together. And I met John Bollinger and we hit it off. And at some point I just asked him, would you run with me? Well, he said, well, I've talked to my family, of course. This does sound a little bit odd, but of course, in Montana, you can do that sort of thing. And I knew in order to be successful that I needed to bring people together. Mm. This stuff that's going on in this country today, where there's just pot shots are being sent across at each other. There's actually, in Montana, there's more things that we agree on than we disagree. And so we need to find those ways of agreeing. And that's what John Bollinger brought to the table. And I think between the two of us, we found that middle ground, and we were able to get things done.
Mm, absolutely. You know, it's fascinating to me. I mean, obviously some strategy there, you know, and you talked about Montana being a unique place in that, you know, there is quite a, you know, split in, you know, the red and blue, but there are things that many Montanans agree on. Can this work today? Can it work anywhere else?
It can work everywhere, but people have to tone it down. You don't have to be disagreeable to disagree. You don't have to call each other names when you disagree. And if you disagree, it doesn't mean that you shut everything down. You have to find a way. I mean, in Montana, we kind of agree on things. For example, I challenged every expense. That's what I did. I said, well, gee, I've run small businesses my whole life. And it doesn't matter what we're doing in government, there's got to be a more efficient way of doing it. We can do it with fewer people, we can do it with less energy, we can do it with less money, but we just have to challenge it. We have to look. So we were able to cut the cost of government without cutting the programs. And so fortunately, I was able to, you know, I told people, look, I'm going to run it like a ranch. And my grandparents all homesteaded Montana in 1910 and 1911. On my mother's side, they came from Ireland. My father's side, they came from Ukraine. And they homesteaded. And the homesteaders that managed to make it, and that was only 1 out of 10, they were people that understood the most important thing that you've got to do. You've got to keep grain in the bin, because Montana doesn't always have good years. And if you have a bad year and you don't have any leftover grain in the bin, you can't even plant the next year and you're done. So from the time I was a small boy, having a surplus, having grain in the bin, making sure that you could make it to the next year mattered. And so that's why in 2006 and 7, Montana, like a lot of states, we had big budget surpluses, and gosh, Republicans and Democrats alike, everybody could think of new ways of spending money. And I said to them, no, we've got to keep grain in the bin. And I know they got tired of that in Helena, hearing me talk about grain in the bin. So I didn't let them spend the money. We kept the money. We held on to it. And when the recession hit in 2009, there were only 2 states that walked through the recession with a surplus, and Montana was one of them. And we did that in 8 years without ever raising one fee or any taxes. In fact, one year we sent $400 back to every homeowner in Montana. We said, look, we've got extra money. It's your money, and we want to put it back in your pocket. So we wrote out a check from the Montana Treasury right back to every homeowner who had been paying property taxes and said, this is your money. Go find something to do with it.
God, that's amazing. You don't hear that too often.
No, unfortunately, it seems like certainly in Washington, D.C., both Democrats and Republicans attempt to bribe us with our own money. And while the Republicans were in control during the last 4 years, you never heard concerns about balanced budgets. You never heard them challenging any expenses. It was just, how much money can we spend? Well, now that there's a Democrat in the White House, suddenly the Republicans care about this again. And they're, we got to be careful about the money that we spend. I agree. So why don't we challenge expenses? Don't cut programs. I mean, we still need we need to have the world's best public education system. We ought to have the best transportation system in the world, and we don't. We absolutely do not. We ought to be in a position that draws people together. But unfortunately, certainly Congress is not cut out to run things. If you visit with members of Congress, they're not CEOs. They're not managers. They just have a vote, and their only responsibility is to vote on a Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and go home. And so, governors, on the other hand, they are CEOs of their state. They have to balance a budget. I think it's 46 states must have a balanced budget. We cannot deficit spend. And so you need to educate, medicate, and incarcerate. Now, when you listen to somebody running for state office and they're talking about all the big things they're going to do and how they're going to save money and all the rest of it, just listen to them and know this. If you look at the state budget of all 50 states, it almost all looks the same. Take a pie chart. Think of a pie chart. 50% of the state's budget is spent on education. About 20% is spent on medication, and about 20% is spent on incarceration. That gets you up to 90%. So if you've got somebody talking about some big idea they've got about saving money or something, and it isn't one of those 3 things, then they're just blowing smoke.
That's interesting. Well, you mentioned 20% spent, statewide budget spent on medication. So healthcare, right? 2020 was an incredibly difficult time for so many people all over the world. What was the most difficult component for you in 2020, and what did you learn?
Well, to start with, we all had to stay home, and we had to learn new things. We hadn't heard of Zoom before, a lot of us, and suddenly we didn't become experts, but we could communicate. I think what 2020 did, as much as anything, is it accelerated trends that were already coming. Distance learning, for example, that's going to be the future. It should have been the past. And those universities that were prepared, they hit it on all cylinders. They didn't slow down a bit. Their students and the families who were paying for their education, they were well rewarded. Those university systems who had not invested in distance learning, they're still trying to catch up. In fact, some of them, many of them, will not make it. There will be 15-20% of colleges and universities in America during the next few years that'll go out of business.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but there is something to be said for certain people who can learn better in person. What are your thoughts on that in terms of technology?
Yeah, but we're changing. Young people, by the time they're 9 years old, they communicate with two thumbs.
Mhm.
Old jokers like me, we had to learn that. And young people, they have learned this distance learning, and they were doing it well before 2020.
Mhm.
They had it figured out. Of course, you need personal interaction. We're people, and people are social animals. But in terms of running business, we can make business more efficient worldwide by doing a lot more online. For example, while I was governor, sometimes I'd get on the plane and Helen and I was going someplace or another. And I don't know, I just like visiting with folks. And so I'd get on that little plane like you would in Helena, and I'd just walk down and shake hands with everybody on the plane before we took off. And I'd find out who they were and where they worked and all the rest of it. And it was usually about 50% state employees. Oh, where are you going? Oh, we have a transportation conference. We got to go to Atlanta. Oh, we've got a health and human services update in Abilene. Oh, we've got this, we got that all over the country. And when I was looking at ways of saving money, I said to my directors, why are we sending 4, 6, 9 people to training seminars all over the country? That's got to cost a lot of money, and that puts them out of the offices and away from their families. So here's what I'm doing, and it wasn't particularly popular. In order for any of the state employees to travel out of state, you need the signature of my chief of staff. So when all these conferences were occurring, there weren't Montanans that were going to them, because I said, look, if this is a conference and they don't have it on Skype, if they don't have a PowerPoint, then why the hell are we going there? So if they have a PowerPoint and you can participate on Skype, you can do it from your office and you'll be with your family by 4:30 in the afternoon, as opposed to getting on a plane, flying across the country and the state of Montana and the people of Montana paying for this. Somebody said, oh, but we need that interaction. It's interacting with other managers from other states and all. Please, we're going to save a lot of money, and you're going to get more done by staying at your office and watching that PowerPoint. You can still ask questions, you can still interact, but that was back in 2009, 2010. So that's the trend that we're going to, and I believe in so many ways, the way we run business, the way we educate, the way we learn things. It's been accelerated by this business from 2020. It was coming anyway, but we've just accelerated it.
You've said learning is, life is learning for life. Tell me what that means in your mind, especially as technology and platforms change.
The old concept was, well, we graduated from high school, we got accepted to a college, we go off to a college and we study something, and at the end of 4 years, we get a job because I have a college degree. Well, that might have been what they used to do. But today, when you graduate from college and you apply for a job, they say, okay, I understand you got a degree, but do you know how to do something? Can you build something, design something, fix something? What is it you can do for me if I'm going to pay you? I mean, a degree doesn't mean anything to me if you can't do something physically. So, for example, while I was governor, we poured money into what we call our colleges of technology. Because what I heard from every business that wanted to come to Montana and every business that was in Montana is we need diesel mechanics, we need electricians, we need plumbers, we need surveyors. And what's more, those people who learn those professions and people who graduate from colleges and get a job, what you learned is oftentimes obsolete within 5 or 10 years. This is moving so fast that learning is for life. And you will be learning the rest of your life in order to be competitive. And that's why we need a university system in Montana and around the country that is prepared to educate people in their own homes. Because if you're 35 years old, you've got 3 kids and you have a full-time job, you can't afford in any way, socially or economically, to go back to college for 2 years. But you can get online and you can learn new things and you can be updated so that you're more valuable to your employer and to your community.
Well, that's fascinating. Yeah. Well, Governor Schweitzer, you've written a book about the history of energy. Tell me about what the motivation was behind that.
Well, from the time when I was first elected governor, I had for my whole life had an interest in energy. I mean, I grew up on a farm in the Judith Basin, and And for example, I asked my dad one time about when they first got electricity on the farm where they homesteaded up on the High Line. And he thought about that a little bit. And he said, you know, it was Roosevelt. It was FDR who said that we cannot have islands of poverty and an ocean of prosperity. See, small towns and farms all over America didn't have electricity in 1910, 1920, 1930. And so we had two Americas. And so it was FDR who said that we're going to create this rural electrification, because the big utilities didn't give a rat's patoot about taking wires out to your farm that was 10 miles outside of town. Mm-hmm. And so the FDR invested money, your money, our money, and we created a system so that we could get electric wires. So my dad said, yeah, but we didn't get it our place until, I guess it was about 1949. Wow, I said, and how did it change your life, Dad, when that happened? He thought about it. Of course, he's German, so they think a long time before they say very much. But when they do say something, it probably matters. He said, well, I suppose it was that we could weld on the farm at a little hotter temperature. Because you see, since 1920, they had had wind turbines with batteries in their basement, and farms all over the Midwest did the same, from Texas to Saskatchewan and everywhere in between, including in Montana. We had one of the biggest wind energy companies in the world manufacturing in Circle, Montana. And so it got me thinking about why we couldn't do that some more. And I was interested in oil because I worked in Libya and Saudi Arabia, and I saw how dependent we were, how dependent America was on energy sources coming from someplace else. And so I became very interested in energy, wind power, solar power, coal gasification, oil, fracking, all of it. I wanted to be an expert in it because I knew that is the future, and Montana has a great role in all of it. So after I left office, I organized my thoughts. And it wasn't just the history of energy, it's the future of energy. So in my book, Power Up Energy, I give the history of energy all the way back to even before Edison and Westinghouse, but then taking it up to, a lot of people didn't know. In 1910, 50% of the cars in America were electric cars. There was an automobile company called Detroit Automobile Company that guaranteed when you drove their car off the lot in 1910 that you could get 100 miles on a charge. And I'm going, what the heck? We've only got a couple models in the world that can even do that today. What happened? So I studied those batteries and why we got set back, why we didn't go forward. In fact, you know, one of the problems was FDR. If FDR would have thought this thing through and thought, you know, Edison was right, distributed energy is the way we need to go. And we already have farmers that have wind power. What we need to do is improve their batteries. Had we invested that same money in the 30s on batteries, imagine where we would be today. And so now the future is about batteries, because we can produce energy with petroleum, with coal, with wind, with solar, with hydrogen power. But you know, you got to have the power when you need it. And so batteries are the future, and technology around storage is the future. Something people don't think about is this: oil, gas, and coal. That is storage of solar energy. 200 million years ago, there were plants that were growing. They were absorbing solar energy. And when they died and they were compacted, they became oil, gas, and coal. That is just storage. That's a storage system, very inefficient, but it's a storage system for solar energy. I think we can do better, and we will.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. I mean, you know, and it's, you know, you talk about these different energy sources, you know, wind, solar, coal, gas. You know, I'm curious if you think that what the future is it a diversification of these energy sources, or are we moving on to a different thing? Is coal?
Well, it is. We're going to change.
Yeah.
You know, in the next 10 years, we're going to be in a position where almost 50% of the cars we drive in America and the trucks that we drive will be electric cars, and they'll all have a battery in them. And we're going to have a system where you can plug in wherever you're at, and it's going to be omnipresent. And whenever a vehicle is not being driven, it'll be plugged in. And these utilities will fight this all the way to the end, but we're going to have time of use metering. So everybody knows, and all these utilities, whenever they go before their Public Service Commission, they say, oh, but we have to have electricity when there's peak demand, you know, on the hottest day of the year or the coldest day of the year, or when, so we have to have an overload of energy for some peaks. And, you know, maybe we don't need it in the middle of the night, in the middle of summer, but we're certainly going to need it in the middle of the winter when it's cold, or maybe for air conditioning. Yeah, that's sort of true. But let's just think about it. If 50% of the cars in America have a battery in them, and 90% of them are plugged in during the time that they're not being driven, do we need that big peak anymore? Can't we spread that load out? And if every one of those cars has a computer in it, and it's deciding whether to buy or sell electricity at any given moment, wow. Does that change the world?
Yeah, no kidding. Governor Schweitzer, way back in 2008, you spoke at the Democratic National Convention. Are your political days over?
Well, I still watch the news. I still cuss at the television. Once in a while, I even throw a boot at it. You know, I care and I remain active, but not in a political sense of running for political office. Listen, once you've been governor, you've been the chief executive officer of your state. And I did that. I did my level best. We walked away with surpluses. We invested new money in education at a rate that no one had ever done before. We advanced alternative energy. We created jobs all across Montana. I was proud of that. It was a chapter of my life. I'm done with elected office. And, you know, plus I'm starting to get old. I'm getting too old to have to put up with people calling me on the phone and calling me an SOB.
Well, you look great, I got to tell you.
Well, thank you.
You know, lastly, just wanted to ask you something. You know, early in the conversation, you mentioned the political division and the state of the country today. What's one thing in the world that makes you feel optimistic?
We're America, and we've always managed to muddle our way through, and we will again. We had some leaders in Washington, D.C. and around the country that made political gains by calling people names. You never get things done when you call people names. You've got to find ways of agreeing. And I don't mean making deals with lobbyists and all the rest of it. I mean, as a Democrat, I recognize that Republicans sometimes have it right. When a Republican says, you know, we need to balance our budgets. We can't continue to spend our people's money. We should send more money back, and we shouldn't have regulation that we don't need. I agree with that. So let's look at the details of how we're going to do this. And when a Democrat says, yes, but if the business that you're running is creating externalities, if you're polluting the water and the air that my family is breathing or drinking, then we have to hold you accountable. Well, Democrats are right when they say that. When Democrats say, we've got to have a public education system because that was made this country great, as opposed to privatizing. Democrats are right about that. So, you know, it's a mix of the two. What I can't stand is when Republicans start acting like crony capitalists and socialists. And they say, I'm going to use the government to fill my own pocket. Or when Democrats do the same.
Yeah.
So
sure.
I appreciate people when they're being clear and when they're staying consistent. But this business of one day saying it's blue and the next day say absolutely not, it's red, that doesn't work.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, former Montana Governor Brian Schweitzer, thank you for your time this evening. Really appreciate it. Don't
ever forget, our best days are ahead of us.
That's really great to hear. I hope so, and I love the optimism. I think we'll get there. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in tonight into the Big Sky Virtual Town Hall. I'm Joe O'Connor with EBS Newspaper, Thanks to our sponsor, Lone Mountain Land Company, and from all of us at EBS and Outlaw Partners. We'll see you next time. Have a good night.